Welcome back to the channel, everybody. Today is Tuesday, October 20th. We have reached the 2-week mark, another milestone in our countdown until the elections on the 3rd of November. It's getting so exciting day after day now. You can honestly feel, as cliche a statement as it is, you can really feel the anticipation building. And it's going to be, after all this prognosticating, all this evaluating, we're finally going to get to finally see what these results are. And this is going to be our 2-week Senate election prediction video. And remember what I said in our last video, our last presidential election video, that's starting at the 10-day mark, which is going to be, I guess, on Friday. We will be providing you with every single day up until election day, starting at the 10-day mark, with an updated presidential and Senate election prediction, as oftentimes in those last 10 days, all the data is very worthy of being crunched. But as of now, let's get into this with only 14 days remaining. So one thing, before we get started here, one thing that I want to mention, basically where these races stand now, you can't kind of unsee that. And what do I mean by that? Well, let's say that in some of these races, something drastically changes. A major scandal is uncovered. One of the senators comes down with COVID. Something along those lines that really upends the race. Well, the reality is there are only 2 weeks left. And so all the evidence, all the data that we've gathered up to this point is still going to carry an awful lot of weight. Okay, so let's jump right into it with the state of Alaska. Such an interesting state on the senatorial level. Not as compelling, if we're being honest, on the House or presidential level, but on the Senate level, there's a lot to break down. Why? Well, as we've mentioned many times before, the Democratic Party has had some success in this state when they often are able to run, like they are this time, independent candidates or often very moderate Democrats. This is, of course, what they did with Mark Begich, who was in office up until 2 years ago. Alaska, remember, was the only state in 2018 on the gubernatorial level that was really friendly to the Republican Party, and that it shifted from blue to red. There were 7 states that the Democrats were able to get flipped from red to blue. While the Democrats did take the House of Representatives, the governorships, that's really where the stardom of the night laid for them. In that they were able to flip some really substantial gubernatorial seats, Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan, a surprise in Kansas. They got back their seat in Illinois, Maine, maybe leaving one of those out, but you get the point. And so in Alaska, the Democratic Party, just as they're doing now, they're running an independent candidate, that being Dr. Al Gross. He sort of fits the bill in the state of Alaska. He killed a bear once earlier in his life. He's sort of this rugged guy. I've seen him speak many, many times, and he's got this sort of gruff, not to be too negative about it, but almost kind of unpolished demure about him. And that oftentimes I think is appealing to Alaskan voters. Of course, the incumbent, Dan Sullivan, is someone who, by and large, is not really that popular, but he's also not that unpopular. He's just sort of an unconsequential candidate by and large through and through. And so that, to me, pretty much signifies the state of this race between Dan Sullivan and Al Gross. Now, polling has been a little unsteady in this state. Now, why do I say the word unsteady? Well, the reality of the situation is there's been very little polling because it's a very difficult state to poll. Okay, the population is often a little bit displaced, kind of scattered around what is a very, not a very dense populated state. And by and large, this is a state that has often gone, the polling has often been, has often led voters and prognosticators and evaluators like myself astray. Okay, so let's look at the most recent polling. Gross +1, Sullivan +8, Gross +1, tie. Sullivan +4, Sullivan +1, tie. Sullivan +13. So you would get the sense, judging by that Dan Sullivan has the edge in this race. Not a very big edge, but pardon the sound here. It just began to rain here in South Florida, as it has been doing virtually all week. So just bear with me through that. But the point I'm trying to get at here is that in the state of Alaska, Dr. Al Gross, I think, naturally has an uphill battle in front of him. Because Dan Sullivan, given the incumbency and the fact that this is not as elastic a state as it is often billed as and advertised as, the reality of the situation is Al Gross is just going to have one of those nights that has given the Democratic Party hope in recent years. And that's just, it could just be your night. Okay, the ball could just kind of bounce your way one evening, but I can't really see that happening yet just based on the polls. I'm only able to label this lean Republican just because we don't always know exactly what the pulse of this state is because it's so hard to gather. And so the polling could be totally wrong and we would have no idea because there's limited polling, and even if there was extended polling, it's not always that accurate in this state. Now, some evaluators have mentioned that Jeff Merkley is in kind of a real race in this state. I think that's complete hogwash. Jeff Merkley is going to be just fine. I don't even think we really need to talk about that. Now, Jim Risch in Idaho is kind of an interesting figure because the Democratic Party, I think, has reason to start beginning to feel a little bit optimistic about the state of Idaho. Because in this area of the country, Wyoming, Idaho, Utah, to a lesser degree Montana, Idaho is actually starting to grow a little bit more and more, and it has like really one of the only major urban areas for this state of the country, and that is the city of Boise. Okay, it's a college town, it's a pretty much an urban area now, to the point where it's also able to elect a Democratic mayor. Okay, and so that combined with some of the margins that we've actually seen unfold in this state are actually kind of interesting, and that is that the Democratic Party's candidates are sometimes able to get 38, 39% even. Now, is that close? No, of course not. But it's, for reference and just for some perspective, it's the same margins that the Republican Party is able to get in Rhode Island, sometimes in Connecticut and Delaware. And so sometimes the opposite party with that kind of voting share is able to actually elect a moderate representative, a moderate senator. Remember, the Democrats have a senator in West Virginia, okay, that being Joe Manchin, and they don't get anywhere near the same results that the Democrats get in Idaho. Okay, so I think the fact that there is a little bit of, a progressive movement potentially going on now in the city of Boise is a little bit encouraging for the Democratic Party, and it might just be the first sign of life for them and their party in this state. But obviously Jim Risch is in no real danger here. Now let's jump down here to Arizona. So this is a state that has a lot of data to back up what we think is ultimately going to happen. Mark Kelly is the one challenging Martha McSally. Now let's start with the Republican side of this. They committed electoral suicide, in my opinion. Doug Ducey, who's an unabashed, very unapologetic Donald Trump supporter, he reappointed Martha McSally to that open Senate seat. Now, only 4 years ago, this seat was held by John McCain. Okay, and the other seat, of course, was held by Jeff Flake. Jeff Flake is long gone, as we know, and that seat was ultimately filled by Martha McSally, by Kyrsten Sinema, who, of course, defeated Martha McSally in that 2018 Senate race. And remember, that was a pretty crucial flip for the Democratic Party because there was sort of an outside shot that they could flip the Senate. It was a little less about the fact that the map was actually friendly to them in any way, and more so it's just that they were actually pretty close. Remember, they only needed 2 seats, and they had some opportunities. Of course, as we know, they also flipped one in Nevada when Jackie Rosen defeated Dean Heller. They came up well short, as we know, in Tennessee. Came up just short in Texas. There were a couple others, and of course they lost 4 of their own. They lost in Florida. They lost in North Dakota. They lost in Missouri and in Indiana. Okay, so that pretty much solidified it for them in that regard. Whereas this time, over here in Arizona, back in 2018, they did manage to get that flip. And remember, this election wasn't called until a couple of days after the midterms themselves. And so at that point, the Republican Party in the Senate was looking at a very healthy majority. I keep clicking on this one ad here going on in the corner. I apologize about that. They were looking at a 54-46, potentially 55-45 majority in the Senate. Which is an extremely healthy majority. And if they had one more strong set of elections in the Senate, you're looking at a potentially filibuster-proof majority, similar to the one the Democrats nearly had in 2008. But the Democrats staved that off when Kyrsten Sinema defeated McSally and when Rosen defeated Heller in Nevada. So that was the first sign of bleeding.
I'm so proud
for the Republican Party. What is going on with this? Okay, that has been muted. Thank God. Okay, over with that. Now, in Arizona, there are also now more House members in the Arizona delegation to the United States House than there are Republicans. The Democrats have also made state legislature gains in this state, as we know. And so all that combined with the fact that we have a very competitive presidential race going on here that seems to be leaning Joe Biden's way, to me solidifies that because of Mark Kelly's really healthy lead in the polls and the lead that he has maintained throughout the election season, that solidifies this for him. I have this as likely for the Democrats. Now let's jump up here to Montana. Okay, a lot to break down here in the state of Montana, so let's kind of jump right into it. So there are 4 different statewide races happening in the state of Montana. That's right, 4. First is the presidential race. Now, obviously, some of the polling has generated a little bit of buzz in the Biden campaign just because he has had some good numbers in that state, but that's not really anything to really worry about it. I mean, at the end of the day, what does a margin really matter? You know, I mean, it's not in that state, it's not a matter of will Donald Trump win. It's just by how much. And of course, that doesn't mean a darn thing, as it's a winner take all system. However, there is a really compelling and interesting House race going on here between Matt Rosendale, who has seemingly run for office like half a dozen times now, most recently unsuccessfully against the other senator from this state, that being Democrat Jon Tester. And even though the Republicans had a pretty good day in the Senate, it wasn't as good as they had hoped because, yes, they flipped to those 4 that we mentioned earlier, but as we said, they lost in Arizona and Nevada. They weren't able to get one flipped in Montana. They weren't able to get Manchin defeated in West Virginia, Tammy Baldwin in Wisconsin, Sherrod Brown in Ohio. There were some missed opportunities for them to really expand that majority and put it away thoroughly in this election. Part of those retentions successfully that the Democrats made, another one being Debbie Stabenow in Michigan 2 years ago, that is part of why the Democrats have a real shot at flipping the Senate. So Matt Rosendale was the one who came up short against Jon Tester in this state, and he is running for the lone House seat in this state now against Kathleen Williams, who also ran 2 years ago, also unsuccessfully. Polling right now, it's another state similar to Alaska that is hard to poll, although some of the higher ranked pollsters have been featured in this state as opposed to some of the lower graded pollsters like Civics and Change Research and polls like SurveyMonkey out in Alaska. Whereas in Montana, Kathleen Williams, with very reputable pollsters and very credible polling, has her leading Matt Rosendale within the margin of error. So that's number 1. But what's so interesting about that is that the current House member is Greg Gianforte, who, of course, was embroiled in controversy 2 years ago when he body slammed a reporter, the whole thing, but he survived his reelection against who? Kathleen Williams, right? So he is relinquishing this House seat, the seat he currently holds, again being challenged by both Matt Rosendale and Kathleen Williams to run for governor against who? The lieutenant governor, that being Mike Cooney. Okay, so far, interestingly enough, Greg Gianforte is actually leading Mike Cooney in the polls. It's not a very healthy lead, but it's a consistent lead, and that is very, very helpful for him. There has not been a Republican governor of the state of Montana in 20 years. Okay, think about that. We consider this state to be a conservative bastion and to be a state that the Republican Party can just file away every 2 years, every 4 years. Well, they can every 4 on the presidential level, even though Barack Obama got 46% of the vote here in 2008. But on the senatorial and governorship level, you combine those two things, it's actually been more favorable to the Democrats than the Republicans in the last 4 years, in the last 20 years, really, if you go dating all the way back to the Max Baucus days and everything beyond that. So right now, Greg Gianforte is actually leading Mike Cooney, the Democrat. So that's a very interesting dichotomy that we're seeing in the polling. Why would the person who is relinquishing one seat and running for another win his new race, but the seat he's relinquishing flips from red to blue? That makes no sense. Okay, so why is that happening? Well, it could be that in this state, what we have seen is there are a lot of Republicans who often side with Democrats on issues of abortion and of environmental issues. Okay, there's a lot of nature, as we know, up in this portion of the country. It's a very picturesque area, lots of gorgeous mountain ranges and vistas and the whole nine. And so Kathleen Williams, apparently, at least so far, we don't know what the final results are going to be, is appealing to those voters, those moderate Republicans, and those wealthy California types who may be sort of moderate Democrats who own second homes up in Montana. Her environmental stances, her abortion stances are appealing to those voters, whereas it appears that potentially Greg Gianforte is also tapping in, maybe to the same voters, we don't know, but on other issues. Okay, we've seen how we've seen a lot of split ticket voting, is what I'm basically saying, over the years in this state. And the utmost proof of that is when Steve Bullock, back in 2016, easily won re-election to another term as governor on the same night that Donald Trump won the state of Montana by over 20 percentage points. Okay, so there is no way that it was just a bunch of Steve Bullock voters and a bunch of Donald Trump voters. So that's impossible. No, it was a lot of Donald Trump voters who just voted for Steve Bullock in big numbers. Okay, so all that is to paint this picture for you as to why this Senate race between, guess who? Steve Bullock, the governor, against Steve Daines, the other incumbent senior senator, I believe. He's a senior senator from the state of Montana. So Steve Bullock famously kind of jumped into the race only minutes before the filing deadline. That doesn't really matter, but he kind of jump-started his campaign a little bit late in the game. After doing that, raised a butt ton of money and instantly jumped out to a healthy lead in the polling. The very first poll that we saw conducted in that state saw Steve Bullock leading by 7 percentage points. And so instantly, right out of the gate, this looked like a state that the Democrats were going to be really, really bullish about. Ever since then, it has trended away from Steve Bullock and towards Steve Daines. Okay, a ton of money, and I mean millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars have been invested in this state. It's kind of an under-the-radar race, even with all that money going into it, because what we just haven't seen is the depth of advertising. Of course, it is Montana after all, but we don't know. Steve Bullock is a very popular incumbent governor in this state. Steve Daines is not that popular an incumbent, but it does go to show you that in some of the bigger stakes races, okay, like Greg Gianforte and Steve Daines, the Republicans appear to have the edge, even though Kathleen Williams is leading Matt Rosendale. Okay, now don't be surprised at all if Steve Bullock wins this race, because this is a Democratic wave year, and I think even if he loses, he'll reach 48%, if not even a little bit higher than that. Okay, but obviously a very interesting race to watch. But right now, I'm only able to label this tilt Republican. Okay, Wyoming is nothing to talk about now. In Colorado, this is obviously another major pickup opportunity for the Democrats. John Hickenlooper is in position, a firm position. He's in the driver's seat to defeat Cory Gardner, who, as we've mentioned many times now over the years, is sort of the last little vestige of GOP politics in this state. Of course, he won back in 2014, defeated a Democrat that was one of 585 million flips in the Senate that the Republicans had on that night. That was obviously a big GOP wave year. This is a big Democratic wave year. Okay, and I think it's going to be a bigger Democratic wave year than it was 2 years ago, which was a little bit more of a ripple, let's be honest, than a full-on wave, especially with everything that we saw in the Senate. But here's the reason, not just the polling that has consistently shown Hickenlooper ahead of Gardner, but the reason the Democrats, I think, really are a shoo-in in this seat to get their second pickup of the evening is because anytime, we've said this many times on this channel, anytime you have a senator or a governor in a particular state that is moving on to other things, whether he's retiring, running for other office, whatever it may be, whenever that same party is able to fill the open seat successfully, that is the biggest endorsement that previous candidate can possibly get. And it really shows you that state is firmly within that party's grasp. Okay. And that's exactly what happened here. John Hickenlooper, remember, didn't at first run for Senate. Okay, he ran for president very, very briefly. It went nowhere, changed gears, ran for Senate, and just like that, at the snap of the finger, the voters in Colorado not only reelected a Democrat, but they elected one that was to the left of John Hickenlooper. Hickenlooper is sort of known and billed as a little bit of a centrist, whereas Jared Polis, as we know, is the first openly gay governor. Now, I want to touch on this one real quick moment. I received a comment in our last video mentioning that every time I do one of these videos, I point out that in both Jared Polis's case, he's an openly gay governor, and in Kyrsten Sinema's case, she's an openly bisexual woman. This particular commenter mentioned, why is it that I keep mentioning that? Is that somehow disqualifying? Let me say absolutely, for the record, that is complete bleep. Okay, I don't want to, get in trouble from YouTube here. That's absolute nonsense. That is not at all what is being implied here. That is, at no point should that have been received in any way. The only reason I do mention it is because it is literally illustrating the very point that these two states are shifting in a certain direction that would elect people like that. Okay, let's face it. The state of Oklahoma would not elect someone like that. West Virginia would not elect someone like that. Nebraska would not elect Kyrsten Sinema or Jared Polis. The only reason I keep bringing that up is because it goes to show you, and it lends credibility to the argument that the states of Arizona and Colorado are shifting further and further to the left. That's all. Okay, and so, if anything, it just spells an even bigger defeat for Martha McSally and I'm forgetting who Jared Polis's opponent was. And it's a full cosign on the idea that in Colorado and in Arizona and in the Sunbelt regions as a whole, the Democratic Party is seeing gains and they're not having to nominate extremely moderate candidates. Okay, there was a time when in the state of Colorado, even someone like John Hickenlooper would have a hard time winning. Well, here he is now running for Senate, and he is going to beat Cory Gardner like a drum. The polling has been very consistent on this. I think he's even more of a shoo-in than Mark Kelly in Arizona. I'm also labeling this likely. Open seat for the Senate here in New Mexico. The representative Ben Ray Lujan is running for it. I do not expect him to have much of a challenge here. It may not immediately be called right at closing hour, but within half an hour, I think most of the networks will call this for the Democrats. Now, Mike Rounds in South Dakota is in no real trouble. It's a state that always needs to kind of be paid attention to because the state Democratic Party in the state of South Dakota is extremely well run. It's one of the best state parties in the United States of either party. It's how they were able to elect Tim Johnson. Remember, people lose sight of this. In 2008, this was not called until 3.5 hours after the polls closed in South Dakota. They had to really count this state. They were not sure. And it was very uncertain whether or not Barack Obama or John McCain was actually going to be able to win these 3 electoral votes. But anyway, Mike Rounds is going to be fine. Now, Ben Sasse, interestingly enough, had this conference call with constituents last week where he went off against Donald Trump and, used some, at least by comparison, let's say, incendiary language. Now, was it actually profane? No. But it was, just by comparison, it was pretty heavy. But that obviously doesn't mean he's in any trouble from his own voters. And if anything, it may have just been a ploy to get even some of the whatever Democrats actually exist in the state of Nebraska onto his side. Now, in Kansas, I do think people are making a little bit too big a deal out of this race. I understand that it's interesting to watch because of what happened in 2018. But let's be honest, folks, Laura Kelly defeating Chris Kobach, that was a one-off. That was an exception. We don't really believe that this state is going to flip on the senatorial level. If we're being honest, let's kind of compare this to Kentucky, okay? The state of Kentucky has a Democratic governor right now, Andy Beshear. And it also has a Senate race going on right now between Mitch McConnell, for crying out loud, and Amy McGrath. Amy McGrath's a very strong candidate, personally recruited by Chuck Schumer, raised ridiculous amounts of money. At the end of the day, she's not going to win. Now, I do understand that Barbara Bollier is a little bit different than Amy McGrath and that she is a former Republican. And of course, there is this similarity with Kentucky in that the state has a Democratic governor. Only that was against Chris Kobach, okay, who's a very, very, very hated figure in this state and who lost in the primary. Okay, just as Matt Bevin was someone in Kentucky that the voters just despised, obviously, to the point where they elected a Democrat, for crying out loud, in Kentucky. Okay, now, the only difference between these two races is that in Kansas, the polling is far, far closer. In fact, the averages actually have it within the margin of error. But do we really expect that Roger Marshall is going to lose this race? No. I'm going to label this likely. I can't label it safe because of the polling. And of course, yes, there is a reason Laura Kelly won independent of her opponent. She obviously tapped into her voters. She appealed to them a certain way, but it's not going to be enough. Jim Inhofe, we're not going to talk about it. Okay, now in Texas. This to me is a little bit of a dark horse. Not too compelling overall, but a little bit of a dark horse. Why is that? Because I think it's more the state of Texas itself that is actually going to potentially boost MJ Hager against John Cornyn. This is not the same as 2 years ago. Beto O'Rourke and Ted Cruz were locking horns in a very, very, very different and far more competitive race than this one. Part of that is the incumbency of John Cornyn. John Cornyn, while he's part of the leadership of the GOP senatorial caucus, at the end of the day, he is not as public a figure as Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz ran for president, okay, as we know, and briefly was even kind of the front runner. Okay, won one of those early primaries, I forget which one, but he's obviously been at the forefront of other controversies. The Tea Party, I'm not saying that's a controversy, but he's been much more in the limelight, is what I'm saying. Just as Beto O'Rourke, look, MJ Hager I think has done a lot of good things. She's very, very well respected by both sides. She's a veteran, the whole thing. She's not nearly as well known and, let's be honest, even well received as Beto O'Rourke. Beto O'Rourke made so much noise about the fact that he visited all 254 counties in the state of Texas. At the time, set the Senate fundraising record until it was shattered into a million pieces by Jamie Harrison in South Carolina. The other point being, look, John Cornyn leads in the polls. Okay, he does. And he leads by usually 7, 8, 9 points. The only reason I still think this is a little bit of a dark horse is that because very late in this race, only about 3 weeks ago, MJ Hager started raising a ton of money. And was able to raise, I believe, $13.5 million in only like a few weeks. So she did very, very well for herself in this state. But that, to me, is a little too late. I just think that because Texas is a far bluer state than people think, and it's basically a swing state altogether now, the reality of the situation is I do think she's going to get about 45%, but it's not going to be enough. I'm labeling this likely for John Cornyn. Okay, now Tina Smith, it was interesting because only today there was a poll released that showed Tina Smith only leading by 5%. But the encouraging news for the Democrats is that I believe it was the same exact pollster that actually had Joe Biden also in a presidential race leading Donald Trump also by only 5%. So that's basically proof that both of them were locked in a little bit of a one-off in this state. And so Tina Smith, I think, is going to be just fine. It's a Democratic wave year. That may just be a one-off. And the reality of the situation is if your one-off bad poll has you leading by 5 points, that kind of shows you where you are. So I'm not going to label it safe, as one commenter urged me not to do. And so I now agree with that. I'm going to label it likely. Okay, Iowa. Very similar to Montana and Arizona. A lot to unpack here, so bear with me here. Okay, a very elastic state. Probably, in my opinion, I think Iowa is the most elastic state politically in the United States. Why is that? Well, let's start with the fact that in 2008 and 2012, both Barack Obama and Joe Biden were able to carry the state of Iowa and its 6 electoral votes both times. Since then, the Republican Party has kind of dominated this state. Both senators belong to them, Charles Grassley and Joni Ernst. Joni Ernst back was one of those senators that won one of the, as I said earlier, just the billions of Senate seats that appeared the Republicans picked up back in 2014 that the Democrats have slowly been trying to chip away at. One of them was Joni Ernst, who kind of led the way with her famous "Let's Make Them Squeal" ad. 6 years later, she is in the fight of her life against Theresa Greenfield. Very early on, I was kind of fascinated with this race because no one was really talking about this race. And most people were talking about Arizona, Colorado, North Carolina, and Maine, but people were kind of forgetting about the fact that, well, there was actually there's an election going on in Iowa right now, and I think at the very least, whoever the Democrat is going to get 45%, and so let's just see what unfolds in that race. Well, that candidate became Theresa Greenfield, who has outraised Joni Ernst every step of the way and leads Joni Ernst and has really taken the upper hand in this Senate race. The most recent poll came out today that had her up by 5%. She has consistently led Theresa Greenfield has led, I should say, by 2-3 percentage points. Now she leads by 5 percentage points. To me, the writing is on the wall a little bit for Joni Ernst. Okay, she's in deep trouble here. I think this is going to be a very close race, but as of now, I expect Theresa Greenfield to come out on top. But let's not forget that part of the reason why I say that is because the Democrats, since the 2016 election, when we saw a huge shift to the right in favor of Donald Trump, have, like I said, nationally been chipping away at this a little bit. There was a governor race here in 2018 in the midterms. The Republican won it, that being Kim Reynolds, but she won by a much closer margin, about 52-47, kind of in that range. So that obviously was a narrowing up from the presidential race. And of the 4 House seats that the delegation sends to Washington, 3 of them are controlled by Democrats, the 4th of which being up in the northwest portion of the state. for years and decades was represented by Steve King, who of course was primaried out by thousands of votes. So the Democratic Party has the momentum here, and I think Joni Ernst is in deep trouble on labeling this tilt for the Democrats. Arkansas, there is no Democratic candidate. In Louisiana, the Democrats only recently nominated their candidate, so it's not really much to discuss there. Now, in Mississippi, Mike Espy, I think it's worth at least talking about. I mean, he's giving it another shot against Cindy Hyde-Smith, but no one should really expect Mike Espy to win this race. He lost in that special election to Cindy Hyde-Smith. The final result was, I believe, 54 to 46. The race got a little more buzz than it probably should have, just because Cindy Hyde-Smith, as we know, they were locked in a runoff ultimately at the end of that race, and Cindy Hyde-Smith had gotten herself into some hot water when she made some racially tone-deaf comments. I think people have forgotten about that by now. Mike Espy's a very charismatic speaker, all that. But there's really no reason to believe that voters are going to vote for him this time when they didn't last time. So Cindy Hyde-Smith's going to be fine. In fact, I'm even going to label it safe. Now, actually, it's kind of interesting now to talk about this Alabama race just briefly, because Tommy Tuberville, for the longest time, looked to be just way ahead of Doug Jones in this race. And I think he still is. The only reason people are talking about it is because a poll that was released on the 16th, so 4 days ago, from FM3 Research, there's only a sample of 801 voters, had Doug Jones leading by 1%. And once that happened, there was a surge of fundraising that was thrown into that race in favor of Doug Jones. Unfortunately for him, his party has kind of deserted him a little bit, because I think they know he's not going to win this race. They know that Tommy Tuberville has the advantage. It's the state of Alabama. Doug Jones, let's be honest, as reputable a person as a lot of people think he is, and I'm not saying that's not my opinion. That's what the majority of people think. Look, he was running against Roy Moore. Roy Moore is not a very reputable guy, and he lost in disgrace, basically. He's not running against Roy Moore this time. Okay, now is he running against the most robust candidate in Tommy Tuberville? No. Okay, Tommy Tuberville's he's probably going to resort to throwing a challenge flag on the floor of the United States Senate when he's trying to filibuster something. So by and large, that's not exactly an endorsement of Tommy Tuberville's standing, as a potential United States Senate candidate. But let's face it, Doug Jones has been down in the polling, by double digits for months and months now. So it's just keep a sort of one half of an eye on it, but I don't think it's anything to really discuss. I'm going to label it likely. That's a change in a characterization, I will say, but it's nothing to be too concerned about if you're the Republicans. Okay, now in Georgia, let's break down the general election first here. This is between Jon Ossoff and David Perdue. Now, we have some recent developments, in this race. Now, throughout the campaign season, this was seen as a competitive race. And one that I think the Democrats felt, a little optimistic about. They weren't necessarily going into it thinking that they were going to win, just as they probably did in Colorado and Arizona and maybe one or two others. But the reality of the situation is it's a competitive race. Okay, it is the state of Georgia. Throughout the election season, David Perdue, the incumbent Republican, has been leading Jon Ossoff, not by a lot, but just beyond the margin of error, like 4 or 5 points. But I would say like every 10, 12 days, we would see a poll that actually has Jon Ossoff ahead by 1 point or 2 points. Okay, so that, it shows that Jon Ossoff has a chance to win this race. Now, Ossoff, while he isn't exactly someone that the Democratic Party is thrilled that he was their candidate because he's not holding a certain office already, what that guy has going for him, he can fundraise like hell. Okay, he was at the center of the most expensive House race in United States history during the first year of Trump's term, but he still lost that race. Okay, so here's the most recent development, though. David Perdue was at a rally, a MAGA rally, just the other day, in which he willfully, it appeared, mispronounced Kamala Harris's name, saying Kamala, or whatever. Said it like 4 different iterations of the name. And look, I mean, let's be honest, guys. That's pretty childish and churlish and petulant and stupid. And that's kind of it at best. Okay, at worst, it's a little potentially racist and a little misogynistic and just prejudicial, okay, in nature. Um, it was a very stupid thing for him to do, in particular when already in his campaign, remember, it wasn't that long ago that there was an ad that they ran that appeared to show, that appeared to elongate the nose of Jon Ossoff. Now, I am a Jewish person. For my Jewish friends out there, it's no secret. It doesn't take a genius to know that that is an anti-Semitic trope. Okay? So David Perdue is not really deserving of the benefit of the doubt right now, I think, from a lot of undecideds and a lot of independents, of which we don't know how many there really are in the state of Georgia. But after that incident, which what happened in that rally, within basically one day, like it was like one day and a couple hours, Jon Ossoff's campaign raised nearly $2 million. $2 million. Okay? So that's pretty, significant. Okay, that shows there's a lot of enthusiasm. David Perdue's he wasn't really riding a huge popularity wave to begin here. And that's substantial, I would say. And another interesting factoid, now this came from the Ossoff campaign, but it has since been independently verified, that since the 2018 governorship race, which was embroiled in controversy between Stacey Abrams and Brian Kemp, in which Stacey Abrams, even with some built-in, disadvantages that she claims, I'm not endorsing that idea, I'm just saying she claims it, that she was, that election was stolen from her, she still got 48% of the vote. What is indisputable is that there were a lot of errors as we have seen over and over and over again in the state of Georgia, in basic tabulation errors and people waiting in line for 11 hours and going home, stuff like that. Since then, according to Ossoff's campaign, and again independently verified, their campaign has successfully, along with outside groups, registered 750,000 new voters. Okay, if 300,000 of them vote, and I'm not even saying all of them vote for Ossoff, I think Jon Ossoff is going to win this race. Okay, so it's very interesting. I'm only going to label this tilt for the Republicans. Okay, and that's a change in characterization. I normally had this seat as a lean. That's a change. Now let's talk about this seat, the special election. This was another one that we ultimately just had to dismiss right away. We can't really do that this time, okay? Raphael Warnock, the Reverend Raphael Warnock, suddenly looks like he may be the favorite to win this Senate seat. It's incredible. This is a jungle system. It's going to advance to a runoff in all likelihood. Right now, Raphael Warnock is leading that pack. Now, of course, the first place vote getter in a general or in a jungle primary is often the loser, because the second and third place finisher, one of them moves on, and the loser of the same party, that the winner consolidates that big vote share and combines it with their own to ultimately upstage the first place vote getter. However, Raphael Warnock has been leading by double digits, 12, sometimes 14 points, which is pretty significant. But here's the real catch here, is that in we've also seen some polls with him in a one-on-one battle between both Republican candidates, that was being Kelly Loeffler and the Representative Doug Collins, and he wins, I think he's won 4 out of 5 of those polls. So that goes to show you that not only is he going to finish in first place in the runoff, or in the jungle primary election, he looks like he's actually defeating his eventual opponent in January in the runoff election. So extremely compelling right there. And for the first time on this channel, I am actually going to label this tilt Democrat. Because right now, Raphael Warnock appears to be in charge of that Senate race. It's incredible. Okay, now in South Carolina, another race we need to break down. Jamie Harrison has raised more money than any Senate candidate in United States history. He raised $57 million in the third quarter. That is staggering, that total, against Lindsey Graham. Lindsey Graham, as we know, is not, banking on a credibility thing going here because let's face it, not a partisan statement again, but, look, he said, use my words against me. Well, we did. And he's back. He's walking back on that. Now, is Lindsey Graham the only politician in United States history that has ever walked back a statement he made? Absolutely not. Okay? In fact, I would challenge people to go and find, of all 50 states here, all 100 senators, you could probably find something that, they have walked back. Okay? Joe Biden certainly has. Kamala Harris has. You get the idea. Anyway, the polling has consistently narrowed in favor of Jamie Harrison over time. but I just can't ultimately see him crossing the finish line here. At the end of the day, the state of South Carolina is just barely conservative enough. And I think it, despite this ridiculous amount of money that Jamie Harrison has available to him, he ultimately can't spend all of it, is how much he has. I'd be a little surprised still if he won this race. I would expect him to get 47% of the vote. I would give him like a 25% chance of winning. Turnout in the state would have to be astronomical in order for him to win. And I just can't imagine that there are enough Lindsey Graham voters that are actually deserting to Jamie Harrison, because that is the way a Democrat wins in this state. There just aren't enough Democrats in the state of South Carolina for him to win just on sheer turnout. You would actually have to pry away voters from the Republicans. I just can't see enough of those happening. So I'm going to label it lean Republican, just because I can't totally see it ending up that way. Tennessee will be a safe state for the Republicans. Now, North Carolina, this was another core state for the Democrats on the Senate level. Cal Cunningham, it looked real good for him. Okay, he was smooth sailing, a lot of consistent polling leads, but the recent sexting scandal was unsurfaced. Okay, and that has not been a good thing for him, because we've seen a little bit of a decline in some of the donating. Now, he obviously raised a lot of money up until then, so the cash on hand was very, very helpful for him. And I think he was ahead by a far enough margin to where he built in a little bit of a margin for error and a little bit of a cushion to keep himself alive in this state. And also further complicating things for the person he's challenging, Thom Tillis. Tillis came down with coronavirus, kind of complicating his and potentially compromising his ability to campaign and defend himself out in the open, even though Tillis appears to be just fine. So Cunningham, I think, still has the edge here. I still think he's being boosted by the presence of Roy Cooper on the ballot, a very popular Democratic incumbent governor, who, by the way, may run for Senate in 2 years and I think would actually win against the GOP incumbent Richard Burr. That's for another time. So right now, I'm going to label this tilt Democrat. Okay, that's a downgrade. Okay, it is, because throughout this campaign season, I had that seat going to the Democrats as a lean margin, but now I have it tilt. Kentucky, we mentioned before, Mitch McConnell's not in any trouble. Neither is Shelley Moore Capito in West Virginia or Mark Warner in Virginia. Now, Dick Durbin is also going to be just fine in Illinois. Okay, let's go up here to Michigan. John James, kind of like Mike Espy down here in Mississippi, is giving it another shot, only this time he's going against the other incumbent. This time it's Gary Peters. 2 years ago, he tried to run against Debbie Stabenow unsuccessfully. Debbie Stabenow, it was a little too close for comfort for the Democratic Party's taste. I believe John James got like 45.7%, I want to say was the final number, and I have to check on that. Remember, but I think back then, 2 years ago, there was still a little bit of anxiety about this state, given the fact that only 2 years prior to that, it had gone to Donald Trump on the presidential level. So people were still a little scared on the Democratic Party side, and I think the Republicans were much more bullish about their chances there, because look, John James is a pretty good candidate for them. He's one of the few black Republican candidates of any real stature. He and Tim Scott are basically the only ones you can really point to right now, in GOP politics that have really sustained their activity, and in the case of Tim Scott at least, have held public office for a certain amount of time. Gary Peters, his polling has been steady. He's led throughout, but it's gotten tighter, and John James has raised a ton of money. Gary Peters is also he's kind of quietly goes about his business. He doesn't really have much of a national standing, which certainly doesn't help him. There have been some interesting kind of weird ads that have been used by both candidates that have. It's a little strange, sort of the whole dynamic of this race. Right now, I still think Gary Peters has the edge, but I'm only going to label this lean. Okay, I normally had this as likely. This is a downgrade for the Democrats. There are only 2 weeks left, so I can't see John James really eking this one over the finish line, but I still think Gary Peters has some campaigning to do, and he needs to run a clean race, albeit for just 14 more days. Okay, now in Delaware, Chris Coons will be fine, just as Cory Booker will in New Jersey and Jack Reed in Rhode Island. And now that we know it's Ed Markey as of September, we'll be just fine there. Now in New Hampshire, obviously a state that the Republican Party often thinks they can be very competitive in. There's sort of a formula for them. They have to nominate a moderate who's very notable within the state, just as they've done now with Chris Sununu in the gubernatorial race. They didn't get that done this time. Okay, it was Kelly Ayotte who's running against Jeanne Shaheen. That's a missed opportunity for the Republicans. Okay, just imagine if the Democrats had a real seat other than Alabama that they really had to defend in here more than in Michigan. and in Minnesota, that would really throw their chances of claiming the majority into real jeopardy. That's just not happening here. Jeanne Shaheen's going to be fine. I'm going to label it safe. I mean, it is worth watching, though, in 2 years from now, because I think Maggie Hassan could potentially lose her race. Remember, she was at the center of the closest Senate race in some time there. She won by 0.1%. And if they throw Chris Sununu at her, I think Sununu would win. Lastly, in the state of Maine, I think Susan Collins is done. Okay, for a long time, I kind of thought that I was hesitant to really put this firmly in the Democratic Party's column. I was always sort of just barely giving it to them. I think she's done. Why do I say that? Because throughout the campaign season, I've sort of pointed to the fact that Sarah Gideon was never able to totally take the bull by the horns. And so we never saw that poll that had her up by 9 points, 11 points, like a big polling it. What we always saw was 4 points, 5 points, 3 points, another one by 2, 4, 5. And it gave you the sense, well, this is kind of right where Susan Collins wants her. She's sort of this resilient figure who's won races as an underdog before, and recently earned the endorsement of Joe Lieberman, which certainly helped her. The reason I'm pretty much writing her off is because there are only 14 days left now, and if you've never led over the course of a race, you're probably not going to win. That's number one. And number two, she absolutely has to run up the numbers like you wouldn't believe up here in the northern portion of the state in the rural county. Right now, that is a House district that is represented by Democrat Jared Golden. Jared Golden is running away with his reelection by double digits. And that, to me, is the final nail in the coffin for Susan Collins. If you have enthusiasm up here for a Democrat, Susan Collins is going to lose, okay? And as a result, I'm going to change this characterization to likely Democrat. So a lot of different things here on this map, okay? We changed a characterization in Minnesota from safe to likely. In Michigan, we downgraded another Democratic seat from likely to lean. We flipped a seat altogether in the Georgia special election. It was only a few weeks ago where we didn't even really talk about this race, and all this new polling has given us reason to believe it's going to go the Blues' way, although obviously we won't know that until January. But let's go through the winners again, as we always do in our senatorial election videos. So we have Dan Sullivan winning in Alaska, Jeff Merkley in Oregon, Jim Risch in Idaho, Mark Kelly in Arizona, Steve Daines in Montana, Mike Enzi, in Wyoming, John Hickenlooper in Colorado, and Ben Ray Lujan in New Mexico. South Dakota will be won by Mike Rounds, Ben Sass in Nebraska, Roger Marshall in Kansas, Jim Inhofe in Oklahoma, and John Cornyn in Texas. Don't want to change that. Tina Smith will win up here in Minnesota, while Teresa Greenfield will get over the finish line in Iowa. Tom Cotton and Bill Cassidy will close it out in Arkansas and Louisiana. Cindy Hyde-Smith fends off Mike Espy in Mississippi. Tommy Tuberville defeats Doug Jones. And then in Georgia, we have David Perdue surviving against John Ossoff, with Raphael Warnock winning the Jungle Primary Senate election. Bill Haggerty will win in Tennessee. Lindsey Graham in South Carolina. Cal Cunningham with a pickup for the Democrats in North Carolina. Dick Durbin in Illinois. Mitch McConnell in Kentucky. Shelley Moore Capito in West Virginia. And Mark Warner wins another term in Virginia. John James comes up short again, this time against Gary Peters in Michigan. We have Chris Coons, Cory Booker, Jack Reed, and Ed Markey winning in Delaware, New Jersey, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts. And then the last two, Jeanne Shaheen defeats Kelly Ayotte, and Sarah Gideon defeats Susan Collins, giving the Democrats a 52-48 win with the vice presidential edge as well. So thank you guys so much for watching. I know this was a lot of information in this video, but as I always do, please be sure to comment down and suggest as well if you have questions, comments, corrections, anything like that. As I always do, as you know I do this, I will respond to them, heed them, and give you a response, as I always like to do. I always like to listen to the commenters. Hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. Hit the like button. And again, thank you guys so much for watching. We've reached the 2-week mark, folks. I'll see you in November.